Hello, everyone. My name is Karenza Kaiser. I'm 29 years old, and for most of my life, I believed I had mastered the skill of staying silent. I learned it at family dinners where jokes cut sharply and everyone laughed except me. I learned it at milestones that should have mattered, yet somehow never seemed to. And I learned it most clearly on a day that was meant to be mine. The day I walked down the aisle, convinced I was finally safe from public embarrassment. I was mistaken. At my wedding, in front of 187 guests, my father took the microphone and made it clear how little respect he had for me. He reduced my existence to a joke. He turned my marriage into a source of amusement. In that moment, I felt the same familiar, paralyzing shame I'd carried since childhood, only stronger, echoing through a room filled with people who didn't know my history but were invited to laugh anyway. What my father didn't realize was that my husband hadn't arrived unprepared. He didn't know that 8 months earlier, someone had begun paying close attention. And what followed didn't just disrupt a speech, it dismantled a reputation, ended a marriage, destroyed a business partnership, and forced the most powerful man in my family to leave my wedding alone. This isn't a story about revenge. It's about what happens when the truth finally refuses to stay silent. If you've ever been made to feel insignificant by someone who was supposed to protect you, take a moment to like this video. Subscribe if stories about quiet strength, long held silence, and finally setting boundaries resonate with you. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from. I read them all. Now let me take you back to where this began. The moment my father picked up the microphone, I knew. Not logically, and not because I had proof, but because my body recognized the pattern before my mind did. My chest tightened, my breathing became shallow, and I felt that automatic urge to smile, even though I wanted to disappear. My wedding reception was in full swing at the Fairmont Sonoma Mission Inn, the kind of venue my father favored because it looked impressive from every angle. White tablecloths, crystal glasses, soft jazz in the background. Guests stood in small groups, laughing easily, champagne flowing as if the evening were perfect. My father, Edward Kaiser, stood confidently at the center of it all. Custom suit, self-assured smile, the posture of a man who believed every room existed for his performance. He didn't wait for an introduction. He never did. He tapped the microphone twice and waited for silence. "I'd like to say a few words about my daughter," he said. The room quieted. I felt my husband's hand tighten around mine beneath the table. Nathan didn't look at my father. He looked at me, calm, steady, like he was preparing to take the impact with me instead of watching from afar. "Carenza has always been a challenge," my father continued, letting the word hang just long enough to sound humorous. Polite laughter moved through the crowd. Not as driven as her brother, not exactly the family success story. More laughter. I focused on the stem of my glass, afraid that if I looked up, I would completely fall apart. "But today," Edward said, lifting his champagne, "I'm proud to announce she finally did something right." He paused, smiling broadly. "So let's raise our glasses to my daughter, who finally found someone desperate enough to marry her." The room reacted loudly. Not everyone laughed. I saw my mother's smile freeze. I saw my aunt's face lose color. But enough people laughed that it didn't matter. Enough people laughed that my humiliation felt official, confirmed by applause. I couldn't move. My ears rang. Heat crept up my neck. That familiar mix of shame and disbelief settled in. Even on my wedding day, he couldn't stop himself. He needed the attention. He needed the laughter. He needed to remind me and everyone else of my place. That's when Nathan stood up. He didn't rush or make a scene. He didn't slam his chair or raise his voice. He simply stood, adjusted his jacket, and walked toward the projector at the side of the room, the one meant to display our engagement photos later that evening. My father chuckled into the microphone. "Looks like the groom wants to respond. Go ahead." Nathan didn't look at him. He reached into his vest pocket, took out a small USB drive, and plugged it into the laptop connected to the projector. "Thank you, Edward," he said evenly. "I do want to say something." The screen behind him came to life, but instead of talking about how desperate I am, Nathan continued, his voice calm, "I think we should talk about what you've done." My father's smile faltered for just a moment, and in that brief pause, something inside me shifted. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one expected to absorb the blow. I wasn't being told to laugh it off, to stay quiet, to keep the peace. Someone else had stepped into the line of fire, and he wasn't stepping back. I didn't yet know what was on that screen. I didn't know how far the truth would reach or how many lives it would affect. All I knew was this: the story my father had controlled for decades was about to be told without his approval, and whatever followed, there would be no turning back. The truth didn't start at my wedding. It began decades earlier, inside a home where love came with conditions and silence was rewarded. In the Kaiser household, two versions of childhood existed at the same time. One was celebrated, the other was merely tolerated. My brother Julian was 4 years older than me, and from the moment he could walk, he was introduced as the future. My father said it casually at first, as if it were praise. That boy's going places. Over time, it became expectation. Julian attended the best private schools. His tuition was never questioned or discussed. It was simply paid. His mistakes were labeled learning experiences. His average performance was reframed as untapped potential. I grew up beside him, but never alongside him. From an early age, I learned the rules without anyone ever stating them. Don't interrupt your father. Don't contradict him in front of guests. Don't ask questions that sound like doubt. And above all, don't embarrass the family. My father didn't need to raise his voice to control a room. He had perfected a more effective method. He relied on humor, timing, and the quiet threat of disappointment. His comments were delivered with a smile and just enough charm that if you reacted, you seemed overly sensitive, ungrateful, or dramatic. Carenza's always been imaginative, he'd say when relatives asked about my interests. She's doing something in San Francisco. When questions came up about my career, he'd add, Julian's the serious one, as if the conclusion were obvious. People laughed. I smiled. And over time, I learned how to make myself smaller without anyone noticing. My mother, Marianne, was always present physically. Emotionally, she appeared in pieces. Gentle, where my father was sharp, quiet, where he was loud. She smoothed situations over, explained his behavior, and told me, that's just how he is. Just how he is, she would say, as if that phrase could lessen decades of impact. Looking back now, I don't think she failed to see what was happening. I think she saw it clearly and didn't know how to stop it. Control in our home didn't come from rules written on walls. It came from money, from timing, from who held the final say in every decision that mattered. My father controlled the finances. He controlled plans. He controlled the narrative. Over time, the rest of us learned to move carefully around him, adjusting ourselves to avoid conflict. When Julian graduated from college, my father hosted a celebration. 50 guests, a hired band, and a speech about legacy and leadership. He spoke about the future of Kaiser Automotive Group as if it were already decided, as if the rest of us were supporting roles waiting for direction. When I graduated, top of my class, honors earned, every requirement met, my father didn't attend. He said he had an important meeting. Later, I learned he had spent the afternoon at his country club. That evening, I received a text message. Congratulations. Don't forget to thank your relatives. That should have been the moment I stopped justifying his behavior. It wasn't. By then, I had already absorbed the most damaging lesson of all, that approval had to be earned by being agreeable, by being useful, by staying quiet. College was where the imbalance became impossible to ignore. Julian's education had been paid for without question. Mine came with forms, loan applications, and monthly statements that arrived like reminders of my place in the family hierarchy. I remember sitting at the kitchen table at 18, paperwork spread out in front of me, trying to understand numbers that felt overwhelming and abstract. My father skimmed the documents without interest. That's just how it is, he said. You'll manage. I didn't know then that money had already been set aside for me. I didn't know that questions had been deflected without my knowledge. All I knew was that I was signing documents that would follow me for years, while my father's voice echoed in my head. Be grateful. Don't cause trouble. So I didn't ask to see records. I didn't ask for explanations. I assumed the issue was me. As time passed, the pattern became more defined. Julian moved into a house my father purchased. He joined the company with a title impressive enough to end further discussion. Promotions came on schedule, regardless of experience. His successes were amplified. his failures quietly absorbed. Meanwhile, I built a career elsewhere. I worked longer hours. I proved myself in spaces where my last name carried no weight. I learned to measure my value privately because it was never acknowledged publicly. At family gatherings, my father's remarks grew sharper. They stayed just short of open cruelty, but close enough to hurt. "Good thing you're pretty," he said once, laughing. "Someone might marry you." I excused myself, cried in the bathroom for 10 minutes, then returned and smiled through dessert. That was my role. That was how I managed. By the time I met Nathan, I had convinced myself this was normal, that every family had hierarchies, that love came with conditions, that silence was a form of peace. What I didn't understand was that, from the outside, my family didn't appear normal. It looked controlled, it looked rehearsed, and it looked fragile. The first night Nathan joined us for dinner, he didn't challenge my father. He didn't interrupt. He observed. He listened. He noticed the pauses, the jokes that cut too precisely, the way the room shifted with Edward's mood. Later, he would ask me a question that unsettled something I'd kept sealed for years. But at the time, I still believed that if I kept trying, kept smiling, kept minimizing, I could make my father proud. I didn't yet see that the system wasn't designed for me to succeed. It was designed to keep me small, and I had no idea how much it had already taken from me. By the time I left for college, I had already learned how to carry weight quietly. Campus felt like a different world. Brick buildings, open lawns, people speaking confidently about futures they assumed were waiting for them. I enrolled at the University of Washington with a scholarship letter folded carefully into my wallet, as if proof might vanish if I didn't keep it close. I told myself I was fortunate. I told myself I could handle the rest. What I didn't acknowledge was how alone I felt signing loan documents at 18. I remember the financial aid office clearly. The beige walls, the hum of fluorescent lights, a woman explaining interest rates as if she were reading a forecast. I nodded, pretending I understood, pretending I wasn't afraid, pretending this was ordinary. My father had made it clear this part of my life was my responsibility. When I carefully asked why things were different for Julian and me, he said Julian needed stability. "You're more independent." Independent sounded complimentary until it didn't. So I took the loans. I signed where I was told. I told myself I'd pay them off quickly after graduation. I told myself this was just how adulthood began. For years, I never questioned why I was the only Kaiser child whose education came with a monthly bill. There were moments when the numbers didn't quite add up. Small inconsistencies that surfaced briefly, then faded. My grandparents, my mother's parents, had always been careful with money. Not wealthy, but deliberate. They saved, planned, and talked openly about the future. They passed away the year before I started college. At 19, overwhelmed with coursework and financial forms, my Aunt Rosalind Meyer mentioned something in passing. We were standing in her kitchen, mugs of tea cooling between us, when she said, "Your grandparents wanted to make sure you could go wherever you wanted. They set something aside for you." I froze. "What do you mean?" "Your education fund," she said, as if it were common knowledge. They were very clear about it. When I later asked my father, he didn't look up from his newspaper. "That money wasn't enough," he said. "It had to be used for other family expenses. You understand?" I didn't understand, but I nodded anyway. By then, questioning him felt risky, not because he would raise his voice, but because he would withdraw. He would become distant, cold, and somehow that felt worse. So I accepted his explanation. I didn't ask to see documents. I didn't ask where the money went. I told myself that if something had been meant for me, I would have known. That if something was missing, it was because I hadn't earned it. That belief settled deeply and shaped how I moved through the world. College became a cycle of effort and exhaustion. I worked 2 part-time jobs alongside my classes. I stayed up late, studied harder, pushed myself because failure felt unaffordable in every sense. Achievements brought relief rather than pride. When loan statements arrived after graduation, I filed them carefully. Monthly payments, years ahead of me, a quiet reminder that my independence came at a cost. Meanwhile, my brother transitioned smoothly into the family business. His path was supported and expected. When he struggled, my father intervened. When I struggled, I stepped back. At holidays, my father spoke about investments, expansion, discipline, and responsibility. I listened while calculating how many more years I would be paying for a degree my family could have covered easily. I told myself this didn't make me resentful. I told myself it made me stronger, and in some ways it did. I built a career on competence. I learned to manage money carefully. I became responsible because I had no alternative. But it also taught me something quieter and more harmful, that I should expect less, that peace required accepting imbalance, that fairness was naive, and that family loyalty meant absorbing discomfort without complaint. By the time I met Nathan, this mindset felt normal. I didn't see my silence as damage. I saw it as maturity. It wasn't until years later, months before my wedding, that the truth emerged in a way I couldn't dismiss. It didn't arrive as an accusation, but as a document. A bank statement dated years earlier with my name clearly printed at the top. A transfer I didn't recognize. An amount that made my chest tighten as I stared at it. In that moment, I realized what I had accepted as circumstance had been a choice, someone else's choice. But at 18, sitting in that financial aid office, I had no way of knowing my independence had been engineered, that the debt I carried wasn't unavoidable, that the lessons I learned about sacrifice and silence were built on a lie. All I knew then was how to endure, and for a long time, that felt like the only option available. Adulthood didn't arrive suddenly. It came quietly, disguised as responsibility. After college, I stayed in the city and built a life that made sense on paper. I found work in finance. I learned the language of spreadsheets and projections. I learned how to speak confidently in rooms where my last name carried no meaning. I rented small apartments. I paid my bills on time. I made decisions without asking permission. From the outside, it looked like independence. From the inside, it felt like survival with better lighting. I worked harder than necessary. Not because anyone demanded it, but because part of me believed that if I became undeniably competent, the questions would stop. That if I proved my worth through precision and output, the quiet judgment I grew up with would eventually ease. It didn't. Each promotion felt like a small victory I carried quietly. It didn't soften. Each promotion felt like a quiet victory I celebrated alone. Each performance review that said, exceeds expectations, brought muted satisfaction, immediately followed by the familiar thought, don't get comfortable. Success, I had learned, was temporary. Approval, even more so. At family gatherings, nothing changed. My father continued to introduce me vaguely, as if my life were a placeholder. She's doing something in San Francisco, he'd say, waving his hand as though my career were a hobby. When relatives asked questions, he redirected them to Julian's latest role at the company, the next expansion plan, the future he always eagerly narrated. Julian had moved into a house my father purchased in Willow Glen. He drove a car with no payment schedule. His job title sounded important enough to end curiosity, even when experience didn't justify it. None of this was framed as favoritism. It was framed as logic. He needs stability, my father would say, as if I didn't. By my late 20s, I stopped trying to explain myself. It wasn't a conscious decision. It became exhausting to translate a life constantly minimized. So I smiled. I nodded. I deflected questions before they landed. At work, I was precise and respected. At home, I was the daughter expected to be grateful for whatever attention came my way. The contrast was dizzying. It often felt almost absurd. I would leave meetings managing millions of dollars, then sit across from my father at dinner while he questioned whether my job was stable enough. I learned to compartmentalize quickly, separating the person I was becoming from the role I was expected to play. But separation isn't the same as healing. I carried the imbalance with me into relationships, friendships, and how I evaluated myself. I became careful, low maintenance, the kind of person who didn't ask for much because asking had never worked in my favor. When my student loan payments arrived each month, I treated them as a quiet tax on independence. I told myself they proved I had made it on my own. I didn't yet have words for the occasional sharp, unwelcome resentment I pushed back down. It was easier to accept the narrative I'd been given, that struggle built character, comfort was earned, fairness was optional. My mother noticed changes in me before anyone else. She'd call and ask how I was really doing, then fall silent when I gave surface-level answers. Sometimes she'd sigh, as if she wanted to say something but didn't know where to start. We never spoke directly about my father. We didn't need to. His presence shaped every conversation, even when he wasn't there. Control doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it exists in what goes unsaid. By my late 20s, my life followed a pattern that looked stable from the outside and felt incomplete inside. I had a career I respected. I had routines that kept me moving forward. I had learned to exist without expecting emotional safety from those who should have offered it. I didn't see myself as damaged or deprived. I saw myself as realistic. I believed this was simply the cost of belonging to my family, that love came with conditions. Silence was the price of peace, and enduring quietly equaled strength. I had no idea that belief was about to be challenged. I met Nathan Cole on an ordinary night, which is probably why it took me so long to realize how much he would change me. It was January, cool and quiet, at a mutual friend's birthday dinner in the city. I almost didn't go. Work had been heavy, my patience thin, and social gatherings still felt like performances I hadn't opted out of. Nathan arrived late, apologized softly, and listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, it was thoughtful and measured, as if he wasn't trying to impress anyone. That stood out more than it should have. We talked about neutral topics at first: work, travel, the surface level exchanges that usually faded by morning. But when I mentioned my job, he didn't pivot the conversation to himself. He asked follow-up questions. He remembered details. He didn't flinch when I spoke with certainty. It felt unfamiliar, comforting, slightly disorienting. By the third date, I noticed something else. Nathan didn't rush. He didn't interrupt silences or try to fill them. He let pauses exist without demanding explanations. After years of adjusting to others' expectations, being met with patience felt like a small shock to the system. 4 months later, he met my family. I told myself it would be fine. I had navigated this before. I warned him gently. "My dad can be a lot," I said, minimizing in advance. Dinner was at my parents' house in Willow Glen, the familiar dining room with the polished table my father loved to reference when guests were present. Edward sat at the head, holding court as usual. Stories about the business, casual boasts disguised as humor, comments landing differently depending on where you sat. Nathan stayed polite, observant. When my father turned to him, I felt the familiar tightening in my chest. "So," Edward said, "you're the new boyfriend. I hope you're not planning to run off like the others. Kenza has a habit of scaring men away." The table laughed. My face warmed. I instinctively tried to smooth things over. My father shrugged. "You have to wonder what's wrong when someone can't keep a relationship past 6 months." Nathan didn't react. He finished his meal, complimented my mother's cooking, thanked my father for dinner, and shook his hand before we left. The drive back into the city was quiet. 15 minutes passed, then 20. He pulled the car over to the shoulder, hazard lights blinking softly. "Does your father always talk to you like that?" he asked. I opened my mouth to explain, to contextualize, to defend. The words lined up automatically. "He means well, he's just blunt. It's not a big deal." But somewhere between thought and speech, they collapsed. Instead, I started crying. Not quietly, not gracefully, but like something long held finally gave way. My shoulders shook. My breath hitched. I cried for 40 minutes while Nathan sat quietly, hand resting near mine, not pressing, not fixing. When the tears slowed, he asked another question, gently, carefully. "Do you know that the way he speaks to you isn't normal?" I didn't answer. I stared out the window, watching headlights pass, feeling unexpectedly exposed. The question wasn't accusatory. It wasn't meant to provoke. It was simply offered. I had no answer. That night, after he dropped me off, I lay awake replaying the moment. How my body had reacted before my mind. How his question had landed somewhere deeper than criticism ever had. Over the next weeks, small shifts began. Nathan asked about my family without judgment. He listened when I spoke, and noticed when I avoided certain topics. Once, when my father called during dinner, and I excused myself instinctively, Nathan watched quietly. He didn't comment or tell me what to do. He simply observed. What I didn't know was that he was noticing more than I realized. He kept notes. Dates, phrases, how my shoulders tensed at certain jokes, how my voice changed when my father's name came up. He didn't announce it. He didn't frame it as protection. Later, he would say he wanted to understand the shape of the problem before naming it. When he proposed in May, it wasn't elaborate. No audience, no spectacle. Just a quiet evening, a simple question, and the steady sense that this was someone who saw me fully and wasn't asking me to be smaller. I said yes before he finished asking. The next morning, I called my parents. My mother cried. My father's response was different. "I'll handle the wedding," he said. "Consider it my gift." At the time, it sounded generous. It sounded like relief. I didn't yet understand what it meant when Edward Kaiser offered to take control of something public. I had no idea that while I was planning a future, Nathan had already begun uncovering pieces of my past I'd never been allowed to see. That realization would come later. For now, all I knew was that someone had finally asked the question I had spent my life avoiding. And once asked, there was no unhearing it. Nathan never announced when the shift happened. There was no statement, "I'm worried about your father," or "I think something is wrong." Life continued on the surface. Work days, dinners, wedding planning calls that increasingly bypassed me and went straight to Edward. If anything, the months after our engagement felt louder, not quieter. More opinions, more control disguised as generosity. What I didn't see was what was happening in the background. Nathan began listening differently, not just to me, but to patterns, repetitions. The way my father spoke about money as authority rather than responsibility, the casual justifications for decisions without transparency, the things always explained but never documented. He didn't confront Edward. He didn't warn my mother. He didn't tell me. He started gathering context. It began with a phone call from my aunt, Rosalind Meyer, in early summer. She was preparing to sell my grandparents' old house, the one they had left to her years earlier, and needed guidance on estate paperwork. Nathan specialized in family and estate law, so she asked for his advice. He agreed to review the documents. That's where he found it. Buried among bank statements and archived records was an account opened in my name years earlier, an education trust. The date immediately caught his attention. The amount did too. One withdrawal, one transfer. The destination? Edward Kaiser's personal checking account. Nathan didn't react impulsively. He made copies. He checked dates. He cross-referenced timelines. When he called Rosalind back, his voice was calm but precise. "Did you know about this?" A long pause followed. Then she said quietly, "I always wondered why Carenza had to take out loans." She confirmed my grandparents had been explicit. The money was intended solely for my education, nothing else. When my aunt had asked Edward about it years earlier, he had shut her down, told her it was family business, told her to stay out of it. "I was afraid of him," she admitted. We all were. Nathan didn't tell me any of this immediately. He kept investigating, pulling records tied to Kaiser Automotive Group, searching for patterns to explain where the money had gone. What he discovered instead was a name he didn't recognize: Lydia Grant. She had been an accountant at the company for several years. Her employment dates perfectly overlapped with the missing funds. Public records showed she divorced in 2019, citing infidelity with her employer. Nathan reached out through a professional contact. He didn't accuse. He didn't demand. He explained who he was, who I was, and why he was asking questions. Lydia agreed to meet him. At a quiet coffee shop in Palo Alto, she told him everything. 6 years, promises, private hotel rooms, messages she'd saved, knowing she might need proof one day. She had lost her marriage, her reputation, and time with her children. When Edward ended the affair, he moved on without consequence. She slid her phone across the table, hands trembling slightly. The messages were explicit, time-stamped, undeniable. When Nathan asked if she'd let him use them, she didn't hesitate. "I've been waiting years for someone to believe me," she said. "Use whatever you need." That night, Nathan drove home with evidence far beyond what he expected. Still, he didn't tell me. He waited. It wasn't until August, 1 month before the wedding, that he finally sat me down at our kitchen table. A thick, unmarked folder rested in his hands. "There's something I need to show you," he said. "Whatever you decide to do with it, I'll support you." The first document was the bank statement. I recognized my name immediately. I stared at the numbers, the transfer, the date, perfectly matching the year I had signed loan papers at the financial aid office. My chest tightened. The room felt smaller. "That's my college fund," I whispered. Yes, Nathan said. The next pages were screenshots, messages, promises written by the man who had lectured me about discipline and sacrifice for as long as I could remember. Messages sent while he was married to my mother, while shaping our family around silence. I read every word. When I finished, I set the papers down carefully as if they might shatter. How long have you known? I asked. 2 months, he said. I wanted to be sure. And what do you want me to do? He didn't answer immediately. He took my hand. That's your decision. We can confront him privately, tell your mother, or do nothing at all. I just didn't want you making choices without the truth. I sat for a long time. For 29 years, I had endured, explained away imbalance, and believed silence was strength. Holding those documents, something shifted. I don't know what I want to do, I said finally, but I know I don't want to stay quiet anymore. That was the point of no return. The plan didn't form overnight. It unfolded carefully over the next 2 weeks. One evening, as fog rolled in over the bay, Nathan laid it out. Your father is going to do something at the wedding, he said. He won't be able to help himself. I knew he was right. So we wait, Nathan continued. If he behaves, we deal with it privately later, but if he crosses the line. He pulled a small USB drive from his pocket. Then the truth gets shown. I stared at it. 4 minutes of evidence, years of lies condensed into something that fit in the palm of his hand. And if he doesn't? I asked. Then it stays in my pocket, he said. I thought about my mother, my brother, the guests, the image Edward had spent decades constructing. Then I thought about the money I'd never known existed, and the years I'd spent believing my struggle was my fault. Okay, I said. We were ready. For the first time in my life, I wasn't bracing for impact. I was choosing where to stand. The morning of my wedding arrived quietly, almost deceptively so. I woke before sunrise in a suite at the Fairmont Sonoma Mission Inn. Mist wrapped the vineyards outside my window. For a moment, everything felt suspended, like the world was holding its breath. My dress hung by the window, ivory silk catching the first light. Beneath my makeup bag, tucked carefully in my overnight case, was a slim folder of copies Nathan insisted we bring, just in case. The USB drive remained in his vest pocket. At 8, my mother came to help me get ready. Marianne looked older than a year ago, more gray in her hair, deeper lines around her eyes. But when she saw me in my dress, her face softened. You look beautiful, she said, adjusting my veil. There was no hesitation, no glancing toward the door. It was the first time she'd said those words to me without caveat. Outside, I could hear my father's voice carrying across the courtyard, decisive, commanding, unmistakably in charge. He was directing staff, checking arrangements, ensuring everything met his standards. The projector, the seating, the timing. This wedding, like so many things before it, had become his production. By noon, guests began arriving, cars rolling up the long drive at steady intervals. Business suits, summer dresses, familiar faces mixed with strangers I recognized only from holiday introductions. Edward had proudly announced 187 guests. When I scanned the list earlier that week, I realized I knew fewer than 40. The rest were there for him. At 5, the ceremony began. I stood at the garden entrance with my father's arm linked through mine. His suit was custom, the kind he liked to mention the price of. He leaned in slightly as the music started. Don't embarrass me, he murmured. I didn't respond. The aisle felt longer than I remembered from rehearsal. White roses lined the path, candles flickering as the late afternoon sun dipped. Faces turned toward us, but I only saw one person. Nathan, calm and steady, eyes fixed on mine. When I reached him, I noticed his hand drift briefly to his vest pocket, then settle again. The ceremony was everything a wedding should be. Vows exchanged, rings placed, promises spoken with intention. When the officiant said, "You may kiss the bride," Nathan pulled me close. "Whatever happens next," he whispered, "I love you." For one perfect moment, I let myself believe nothing else mattered. Applause followed us down the aisle. My mother dabbed at her eyes. Even Julian managed a genuine, if stiff, smile. My father clapped the loudest, already positioning himself near the microphone for the reception toasts. The ceremony was over. The real event was about to begin. By 7:30, the reception was in full swing. Dinner had been served, filet mignon and salmon, Edward's choices. Champagne flowed freely. The band played soft jazz while guests mingled between tables. Everywhere I looked, Edward was working the room. Handshakes, backslaps, loud laughter at his own jokes. Then, without invitation, he picked up the microphone. No introduction, no cue, just two sharp taps broke the silence. "I'd like to say a few words about my daughter," my father began. My stomach dropped. "Carenza has always been a challenge," he paused, letting the words settle. "Not as driven as her brother, not exactly the family success story." Polite laughter rippled through the room. Nathan's hand found mine under the table. "But today," my father continued, smiling wider, "I'm proud to say she finally did something right." He raised his champagne glass. "So, let's toast my daughter, who finally found someone desperate enough to marry her." The room erupted. Laughter filled the space, loud and unchecked, sanctioned by the man holding the microphone. Not everyone joined in. I saw my Aunt Rosalind pale. My mother's smile froze, eyes searching for an exit. But the laughter drowned it out. I couldn't move. The sound pressed in from every direction. In front of nearly 200 people, my father had reduced my life to a punchline. This was his pattern. Jokes disguised as truth, humiliation framed as humor, expecting me to absorb it quietly and be grateful for attention. For a moment, I thought I might stand, say something, anything. But before I could, Nathan did. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't rush. He simply stood, straightened his jacket, and walked toward the projector meant for our engagement photos. My father chuckled into the microphone. "Looks like the groom wants to respond. By all means." Nathan stopped beside the laptop, calm as ever. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out the USB drive. "Thank you, Edward," he said evenly. "I do want to say a few words." The screen behind him flickered to life. "But instead of talking about how desperate I am," Nathan continued, pausing until the room quieted, "I think we should talk about what you've done." My father's smile faltered. For the first time in my life, I wasn't bracing for impact. I was watching truth step into the light. The room fell silent unnaturally, as if the air itself had stalled. Nathan waited, one hand lightly on the laptop, until every laugh had faded into uncertainty. My father's face shifted from confusion to irritation. "What is this?" Edward demanded. "Turn that off." Nathan didn't look at him. He clicked once. The first image appeared, a bank statement, crisp, unmistakable, dated years earlier. An account in my name, an education trust that followed by a full withdrawal to Edward Kaiser's personal checking account. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence stretched long enough for the projector's hum to stand out. My pulse felt loud in my ears. "This," Nathan said evenly, "is the college fund Carenza's grandparents set aside for her education." My father opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. "This is a misunderstanding," he said. Nathan clicked again. "And this," he continued, "is where that money went instead." A few gasps rippled through the room. Phones appeared, first discreetly, then openly. My father stepped toward the laptop. "This is a private family matter. You made it public by picking up the microphone," he said. "Bank statements aren't opinions," Nathan replied calmly. "They're records." He let the image stay on the screen long enough for the reality to sink in. People began doing the math in their heads. Then the audio played. My Aunt Rosalind's voice filled the room, steady but strained. She confirmed the documents, the money had been intended for me, and she had questioned its disappearance years ago. Edward had shut her down. My father's face went pale. "Turn it off," he snapped. "This is evidence," Nathan said, "and we're not finished." The next slide appeared, text messages. Sender, Edward Kaiser. Recipient, blurred. The content, promises, plans, intimacy spanning years. Dates and timestamps aligned with family holidays, work trips, and the life my mother thought she was living. A champagne glass slipped from someone's hand and shattered. No one moved. "These messages span 6 years," Nathan said. "They've been verified and notarized. The woman involved has provided a sworn statement." My mother stood. She pressed a hand to her mouth, gripping her chair as if the room had tilted. 32 years of marriage, exposed in text bubbles for nearly 200 people. "This is fabricated," my father said, voice cracking. "I'll have you arrested." "For what?" Nathan asked calmly. "Showing messages you sent with timestamps and phone records." Whispers spread. People leaned toward one another, eyes darting between the screen and my father. The carefully constructed image, successful businessman, devoted family man, was unraveling in real time. Then Howard Linton, my father's largest business partner, stood. A man who had shared Christmas dinners with us, a partnership worth hundreds of thousands annually. Howard didn't speak. He nodded once, took his wife's hand, and walked out. The sound of the doors closing landed heavier than any accusation. Others followed quietly. Chairs scraped, faces tight with discomfort. Julian sat frozen at the head table, drained of color. He didn't defend our father. He just watched the world he'd been promised crack open. My mother moved toward me, unsteady, wrapping her arms around my shoulders. 32 years, she whispered. I trusted him for 32 years. I held her while she cried in the middle of my wedding reception. I didn't feel vindicated or triumphant. I felt clear. When I looked up, seats were empty. More were still leaving. The laughter from minutes earlier had turned to murmurs and the quiet tapping of phones. My father stood alone near the microphone, clutching it as if it anchored him. Nathan walked over and gently took it from him. I want to be clear, he said to the remaining guests. I'm not desperate. I'm not settling. I'm the luckiest person in this room. He looked at me. Despite the chaos, the grief, the exposure, warmth spread through my chest. Carenza is brilliant, he continued. She's kind. She spent her life being told she wasn't enough by someone who needed her to feel small. Turning to my father, he said quietly, You had years to be her father. You chose control instead. Addressing the room again, Nathan said, If you'd like to stay and celebrate, you're welcome. If you'd rather leave, we understand. Dinner is paid for. A few people laughed, relief softening the tension. My father didn't wait. He walked toward the exit, pausing once, eyes finding mine. You'll regret this, he said softly. No one answered. The doors closed. I waited for guilt, the instinct to apologize, the reflex to smooth things over. None came. Instead, I breathed. Nathan's hand found mine, and I realized the truth hadn't destroyed my wedding, it had freed it. The room slowly found balance. By the time the band played again, the crowd had thinned. Some guests returned, sitting with cautious smiles. Others left quietly. Later, I learned just over half had stayed. My father was gone. Nathan stood beside me, steady, hand warm in mine. Are you okay? He asked. I considered it. My wedding reception had detonated. My mother cried. My family fractured in full view, yet I nodded. I think I am. We cut the cake. Vanilla, not my first choice, but I barely tasted it. College friends hugged me quietly, saying they'd always sensed something was off. Aunt Rosalind told me my grandparents would have been proud. Nathan's mother welcomed me into her family without condition. By 11:30, the last guests had gone. The lights dimmed. The garden grew quiet. That night, in our hotel suite, my phone sat face down. When I finally checked it, there were missed calls, voicemails, a text from my mother saying she was staying with Rosalind, and a message from my brother asking why I hadn't warned him. I didn't respond. For the first time, I let silence work in my favor. The fallout came quickly. My father's largest business partner ended their relationship within days. Others followed. Contracts paused. Questions were asked. The reputation Edward had spent decades cultivating couldn't survive truth. My mother filed for separation before the month was over. When we spoke, she told me about debts, fear, and the ways she had disappeared inside her marriage. She didn't ask me to fix anything. She simply said, "Thank you for showing her the truth." My brother reached out later, tentative but honest. He admitted what he had benefited from, even if he wasn't ready to apologize. We didn't repair everything. We didn't need to. We started with honesty. As for my father, I stopped chasing explanations. We negotiated repayment for the money he'd taken. I set boundaries clearly. Limited contact, witnesses present, no commentary on my life. He agreed with a single word. It was enough. By 30, the weight I'd carried for years had loosened. I paid off my loans early. I earned a promotion on my terms. Nathan and I built a marriage rooted in respect rather than performance. I don't hate my father. What I feel is clarity. Some people need others to feel small to feel important. That was never my burden. My wedding wasn't the end, it was the start of my boundaries. If you've been made to feel small by someone who should have protected you, know this. Surviving quietly doesn't make you weak. You're allowed to stop surviving and start choosing yourself. If this story resonated like this video, subscribe for more stories about reclaiming your voice and setting healing boundaries, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I read everyone. I'm Carenza, and this was the day I finally chose.